What's up? It's Greg from GMH Audio, and I want to talk about guitar tone. Specifically, I want to talk about the tone from different amps and different cabs, and what the difference is between how different amps sound and how different cabs sound, and what really makes a bigger difference in your guitar tone. So here's what I did. I have up in Pro Tools here, I recorded a guitar lick, just DI dry. Here's what that sounds like. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to reamp that through a few different combinations of amps and cabs so we can try and figure out exactly what the difference is in tone that we're hearing. I went for like a kind of crunchy, hard rock, classic rock kind of sound because that was something that was in the range of all these amps. I didn't want to try and push the amps to do something that they don't naturally do because they're not going to sound their best. But a kind of crunchy rock tone for these is all in their wheelhouse. I used 3 different amps that are really different. I used a Marshall JMC 2000 dual super lead. I used a PV6505, and I used a Vox AC15. The Marshall's 50 watt, the PV is 120 watts, the Vox is 15. We have 2 British amps, 1 American amp, a combo, 2 heads, from modern high gain to like the Beatles. So a really wide range of different tones. We're going to see if we dial up a crunch sound with those, what they all sound like and what the differences are. So here's what I did. Let's pop in here. Here's that DI one more time. And all these tracks are that same DI run through different amp and cab setups. So here's this first one. We have a Marshall amp through an orange 212 cab. All these cabs were mic'd up with a single SM57. I put it right where the speaker cone meets the speaker dust cap, and I kept that exactly consistent, didn't even touch it, just unplugged and replugged in heads. So here is the Marshall through that orange. So there you go, crunchy Marshall rock tone through a vintage 30 speaker in an orange. Now let's listen to the PV through the exact same rig. Cool, so it definitely sounds different, but I think what might even be more striking than the differences is how similar it sounds. And that's kind of what I wanted to show you, that the speaker and the cabinet actually makes a huge imprint on the sound. And it actually kind of is like a filter that anything you put it through will kind of sound like that, even if they're drastically different. So we could listen to specific differences between these. Definitely the PV's got a lot more mid-forward. The Marshall sounds a little more scooped. And the style of distortion is a little bit different as well. Even though they're both a similar level of distorted, the PV's got more of a honky distortion and is a little tighter. Now let's listen to the Vox. This is the Vox AC13. I disconnected the internal speaker and just connected it to the exact same cab setup. Again, sounds pretty cool, but still you're getting that same character. You're getting that same character from the cab. Very different amp. Here's a 15 watt Vox versus 120 watt PV. I don't think it sounds near as different as people might expect, but where you do get differences, again, is in the way it distorts. The Vox, this is a 15 watt amp. We're actually pushing it hard, so we're getting preamp and power amp distortion. And you can hear that kind of loose, saggy sound, especially on the palm mutes, where it sounds like the amp's struggling to keep up. Whereas the PV, we're running 120 watts, to get the same volume is not very light, so you got really tight palm mutes. But again, they still have that same sonic imprint, and that comes from the cab. So what happens if we switch up the cab? First, I'll play you that Marshall through the orange again. And here's the Marshall through a Marshall 1960 412 cab. This has 75 watt Celestions, totally different speaker, totally different cabinet. Now that sounds completely different to me. It has a whole different character. To me, switching up the cab sounds more different than the three very different amps all through the same cab. Let's listen to that one more time. Through the orange. And the Marshall. That's the exact same settings on the Marshall. I just unplugged the cab, plugged in another cab, and we get drastically different sound. So if you're thinking about tone, yes, the amp's important, and it will affect how it distorts, and this kind of broad stroke kind of feel-based thing, but really a lot of what you'd think of as the tone of the amp is coming from the cab. And what happens is it's like a sonic filter that goes over everything. And it's not something you could correct for with broad EQ moves like the EQ moves on the amp. It's really like a different fingerprint that makes it distinct. So here's another kind of crazy thing. I mic'd up all 4 speakers with the exact same microphone in the exact same position of that Marshall cab individually. Let's listen to that. That's wild. Those all sound very different. I would say this first one is probably the brightest. And this last one's probably the darkest. This one, to me, is the most balanced. The variance between these 4 speakers is more different to me than the variance between any of these 3 amps through the same speaker rig. So you really want to think about what speakers are you running through, what cabinet are you running through, because no matter what you run through one of these dark speakers, you're never going to get like a bright, twangy tone because the speaker is going to impart that kind of darker sound no matter what you do. Here's another experiment I wanted to do. I ran a amp sim. I used this guy. This is a Neural DSP archetype Nolly. This is a Marshall style amp. And I loaded up an impulse response that I actually made of this same orange cab with the 57. I didn't make it of this exact setup, so it's not in necessarily exactly the same place, but it's the same cab, same mic. Let's hear what that sounds like. Versus the Marshall I just mic'd up. Definitely you're getting a different in amp style. This is a lot more mid-forward, but that character of that cab is still in there. And of course we can then switch this up. So I also have impulse responses. Here's an impulse response of an Audix D4. So that's a different mic on the same cab versus this. Just different mic in the same spot on the cab. Very different sound, much brighter. The mids are completely different. Now I also have, let's see, here's that Marshall with an SM7, similar to the Marshall with the 57. Compared to maybe my favorite one of these we just did. Again, the mid-range of the amp's different, but you still get that sonic imprint of the cab. I'm going to show you a couple other things. Let's say we wanted this Marshall and this Vox to sound more similar. So here's the Marshall. Here's the Vox. Definitely the Vox is brighter, the distortion's different, but say we want to kind of approximate that tone to kind of make concrete what the differences are. So I load up 2 EQs. And what I did, this EQ is on the Marshall, and this EQ is getting fed from it, and I match EQ'd the Vox to the Marshall. So theoretically, this is an EQ curve that will make the Vox sound like the Marshall. Let's see what that does. Actually sound pretty similar. You still get kind of that low-end flubbiness, especially on the palm mutes, because the Vox power amp is behaving different. But as far as the tonal character, these pretty broad strokes are actually all that's doing. It's really just like making it darker, scooping out a little bit of mid-range. This is the kind of stuff you might be able to do with an EQ pedal or an EQ even on your amp, depending on what EQ capabilities the amp itself has. You might be able to make this kind of sound like that. And that's running through the same cab. But what if we wanted to match a cab to a different cab? What would that look like? I did a similar thing over here. So this is the EQ match of this amp sim with no cab to this amp with a cab. Let's see what that sounds like. Sounds pretty similar. So essentially, what the cab is doing to the guitar amp cymbal is this insane EQ curve with all these spikes and dips. That's why the cab has its own kind of fingerprint that you can't really get rid of. There's no EQ that you turn a knob on an amp that's going to give you plus 4 dB at 2.6, minus 2 dB at 2.8, and another plus 4 at 3.4. Nothing gets that detailed. And it's all these little peaks and valleys that give a specific speaker its kind of character. And that's why anything you run through it is going to kind of sound like this. It's this crazy shape. That's essentially what an impulse response is. It's saving an imprint of an EQ like this from a cab, and then you run it through, and then it simulates the sound through that cab, through that speaker. I have another one here. I have the Marshall cab loaded up with the SM7, and I want to match it to the orange cab. So this is what that looks like. That's with the orange impulse. And that's with the Marshall impulse EQ matched to the orange. So this is essentially the difference in tone between the orange cab and the Marshall cab. And if you look at this, again, it's crazy spikes. You're never going to be able to do this with a traditional EQ pedal or EQing your amp. You're never going to get plus 11 here and minus 9 here. This is the sonic difference between these two setups that gives it that distinctive character. That's why anything you run through it kind of sounds the same. So anyway, that's all a nerdy way of showing you that cabinets and speakers actually have a really big effect on the tone, maybe even more so than the amp, at least in a different way. Whereas the amp kind of controls the overall frequency balance in a broad way, controls the character of the distortion, a cabinet's really going to put its sonic fingerprint on whatever you put it through. So if you're looking to change up your tone, maybe you don't need a new amp, maybe you need a new speaker. And if you have the decision between purchasing a nice amp, running it through like a crappy budget cabinet, or maybe running a more modest amp, but through a nice cabinet, I would actually go for the nice cabinet in most situations, because that's going to be on your tone no matter what. And even a kind of crappy amp through a nice speaker can sound pretty decent, and it would be easy to upgrade later that amp, get a bunch of amps, and if you have a good speaker, they're always going to sound good, and it's always going to have your tone. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this nerdy look at speakers and amps.